All right, so first of all, this is going to be broken up kind of big picture into a few pieces. So we're going to kind of start, first of all, why are we here today? Then we're going to go kind of through some history of where we've been, where are we currently. These are all kind of in terms of jobs in the economy, and where do we think we're going? This is also an opportunity for us to talk about our forecast that we do in the office, and then just kind of a brief synopsis of this whole discussion. So first of all, why are we here? So you can everyone kind of knows we're the demography office, right? And the core piece of demography is counting people. And so what's the role of an economist in that, right? So a lot of people might ask, why am I here? And the answer is really that jobs are people. You can't; those two things are linked together, and so that's a core part of how we view everything. Cindy later will talk a little bit more about this, but a big part of the forecast is we forecast our jobs and we forecast our people, and those things should be in balance. And if we have in our forecast that there's going to be 4 jobs per person, well, that doesn't make sense. And if there's 1 job for every 4 people, that doesn't make sense. And so that's kind of how all of this fits together. Um, and so, in that idea of jobs and people, so there's really kind of 2 components of that, which is first of all, jobs. Or people fill jobs, right? And so you have a job, someone comes and fills that job, but also people create jobs indirectly because through their spending, for instance, when you go out and buy goods and services, that's an example of someone that's going to have a job to fill that. And then the other part I want to kind of highlight in all of this is that as we go through this forecast, it's really kind of an ongoing draft, is how we like to think about it. And so we do our forecasts using statistics and other methodologies, but we also like to hear from people and know what's going on the ground because that can inform how we think about these forecasts. So if you know an employer is coming into or leaving at your area, we like to know those things because we can incorporate that information over time. Also, just what, what you'll see here is a lot of graphs and charts that we come from our website, and so you guys are always encouraged to go to those, but we also like to hear ideas that you have, feedback on those, so feel free to reach out to any of us. All right, so first of all, going to that connection of jobs and people, a big piece of this is showing job change and net migration. And the orange is the change in jobs, and in that blue line, that's net migration. So what you've seen historically in Colorado is that we tend to grow jobs, and then people come and fill those jobs. And so that job growth tends to be followed by the net migration. Now, kind of looking historically, one of the things I want to talk about here is how the composition of Colorado has really changed from over the last 20 years. So this is looking at 2001 and 2022. And what you see here are just the total jobs by sector in the state in 2001. What I want to kind of highlight here is look at some of our top sectors: retail, trade, construction, local government, accommodation, food services. We really like to, in our office, when we do our models, we think about industries really not so much from the classical industry perspective, although we'll be talking about that a lot today, but from the idea of kind of there's 2 classes of jobs. There's base jobs, and those are jobs that really kind of bring money into a region from outside of it. So examples of that might be manufacturing or tech industry is a big one here in Colorado. Those types of industries, but also things where that bring spending in. So it could be tourism, or it could be people, retirees also have money coming in from pensions and their savings that they're going to spend down, and that also brings money into the region. The other side of that is what we usually refer to as local resident services, and so those are the jobs that really kind of support those people that are spending the money. So retail, accommodation, food services, those types of things are that. Tourism's also, even though it's kind of more of that people sort of jobs, how I like to think of the local resident services, that's also a base industry because it's moving money in from outside. So if you look at the composition here in 2001, it's really kind of focused a lot on those local resident services. It's top heavy in that. Going to 2022, what we see is that we've really had a change, and our #1 industry now is professional, scientific, and technical services. And that's one of base industry, and that's been where we've seen the most growth overall in Colorado. Um, but then you do see some of that support in health services and some of those other job industries that are more typical and look more like the last one, but it represents a major change. When we start talking about, and then kind of moving forward a little bit, so this is comparing 2019 and 2022, and what industries have grown kind of since kind of pre-COVID to now. So professional scientific technical services, still a huge growth industry. We grew 86,000 jobs over the period. About half of those were in that industry. And then transportation and warehousing, when you think about people kind of shopping from home a lot more, that was a big growth industry here nationally. Where you saw declines, natural resource mining, that's been kind of a overall trend that's been occurring in the state, but also in particular, if you remember back in 2020, it's hard to remember, gas prices or oil prices briefly went negative, and that really kind of upended a lot of things, and that's an industry that can be slow to start back up. Then accommodation, food services, arts and recreation, people were dining out less, going out to concerts less, that's all coming back, but we're looking at that kind of entire period. We go 21 to 22, so kind of the past year in our analysis, we do see that bounce back, especially in accommodation and food services, but then still continued growth in that professional science and technical services. That's an industry that keeps growing here in the state. Now kind of where are we today? So that's kind of where we look backwards in our data. Now I'm relying a little bit on our friends over at the labor market information. And so this comes from their website, and it's looking at over the last 12 months. This is as of, I believe, September, so 22 to 23, just to get a more up-to-date view. And so what you see is we've added another 40,000 jobs, so we're still growing jobs, and that accommodation food services, again, really kind of leading the way. You're also seeing declines in some of those more interest rate sensitive sectors, in particular finance and insurance, construction, and then we also see declines in administrative support, waste management services. That's really because a lot of that industry is around support for office buildings, and as we know, a lot of those have not gone back to being the full occupancy that they were pre-pandemic. All right, so now we looked at that net migration and job change, and another thing we like to look at is that net migration unemployment. So what you see here in the red line, that's Colorado's rank among states in terms of unemployment rate. And so the lower our unemployment rate is relative to everyone else, if we were the lowest, we'd be at the top of that chart. And then we have that net migration again in blue. And so we see a really strong correlation here. And what this means is that when Colorado has a lower unemployment rate relative to the rest of the country, people tend to move here to fill those jobs. Looking at this for 2022, so that map on the right is one that Nancy was showing you, and so that's where people have been moving to Colorado from in 2022. On the left, I've got a map of the unemployment rates by state across the nation, and you can actually see a little bit of a correlation here. So on that left-hand map, those darker colors, those are places with higher unemployment rates, and the red colors on the right are where people move here from. And what you see is that typically the places with those higher unemployment rates are where people are moving to Colorado from. And then when we kind of look at this for a current perspective, as we start moving into the future, where might people be coming from? Well, again, those darker red states. And so this is where we think about this. Colorado is still below the national average for unemployment. We're at about 3.2% versus 3.8% for the nation. And so there are a lot of states with higher unemployment rates from us. And so there are definitely people who might be moving here to fill those jobs. Also thinking about the future, I just kind of wanted to highlight from what are the industries that are expected to grow over the next decade. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and just wanted to highlight some of their top industries. So healthcare, social assistance, professional business services. Our top two largest industries are two of the industries that are expected to grow the most. So that's something that you would expect to see to continue into the future for Colorado. On the flip side, the industries that we're expecting to see declines, those are places that Colorado tends not to have a lot of exposure to, so mining, utilities, federal government, and manufacturing. And then that retail trade's a little bit of a trade-off with the transportation and warehousing as retail kind of moves to more online shopping. Now into our projections. So this is, again, that new jobs and net migration. And so you can see this, but now we're moving out into the future to 2050 and show where we see things going kind of past where we are right now. A couple highlights I just wanted to have for where we have for growth. So our expectation through 2030 is that we'll grow about 300,000 jobs, 2040 about 650,000 more jobs, and 885,000 more jobs through 2050. And Cindy will get to this, but people is more 550,000, 1.2 million, 1.65. And so basically we're at around 0.55 jobs per person is our growth rate we're expecting, which is a little bit below where we have been historically. And part of the reason for that is just that we're older. We're going to have lower labor force participation just because we have more retirees. And so our population is going to end up growing more than our jobs have historically, just due to some of those demographic shifts, which Cindy will probably touch on later. And then looking at this, where do we expect those jobs to be across the state? And so here we have on the left is kind of a total job change, and right is the percent job change through 2050, and just kind of highlighting the areas. So again, the Front Range historically has been where most of our growth is. It's usually around 85%. We kind of expect that trend to continue. But what we do expect is a little bit more change within the Front Range. So in particular, Weld County, Elbert, places we see a lot of percent job growth happening in those areas along with the people. And then we also see growth kind of again through the Central Mountains down to the southwest corner of the state. We do expect to see kind of continued declines, which has also been the trend in the northwest and southeast corners of the state. Finally, just again to kind of wrap things up, so why were we here? So that's that concept of jobs and people, that those are tied together, and that's critical to how we think about our forecasts. And then also just kind of highlighting, a thing I want to highlight is some maybe kind of changing dynamics. So again, we used to create jobs and then people would fill those jobs. Now as we get older and we have a lot more retirees in particular, we're going to probably have more of those people jobs just because we're going to have more people who are out buying things who are not also working. And so that's going to change a little bit the dynamic of what the state looks like. And so our population growth might actually demand jobs in and of itself. So that might be a changing dynamic. And that is it for now. And so now we're going to move into a panel discussion. And so I don't know if Tatiana is here and can come up. But I will introduce our panelists, and then we can move into that. All right, so I am going to introduce our panelists here. So basically the way this works is we have people representing a few different regions of the state to talk about those regions, but also because I want to provide perspectives from different economists around the state. Everyone looks at things a little bit differently, and so they can provide a different flavor for everything. And so the three people that we're going to have here are Nathan Perry, who's a professor of economics at Colorado Mesa University, and he's here to really provide a perspective from the western slope of the state. And there's Nathan here now on the screen. Then we have Meredith, who has also just shown up, Meredith Moon, who's the chief economist and director at Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation, and she's here to represent the Denver metro area and also talk some on the Northern Front Range. And then Tatiana Bailey, who I think is here in person, although I have not. Oh, okay. You can come on up to the table here if you would like. Sorry. And Tatiana is the founder and director of Data-Driven Economic Strategies in Colorado Springs, and she's going to provide the perspective from the Southern Front Range, so really Colorado Springs and Pueblo. And so the way I've got this laid out is we're going to kind of do this in a few parts. So first, I'm just going to go around with a group question for everyone, and they're all going to take 2 or 3 minutes to go through and just tell us about 2 or 3 major trends that are happening in their regions. And then I have some more specific questions for each of them to dig a little deeper into that. So with that, I might start with you, Nathan, because you're at the top of my screen. And so if you can just take a few minutes and let us know 2 or 3 of the biggest kind of trends that you see impacting the region that you really cover here.
Yeah, well, I think 2 of the trends match what's going on in the rest of the state and the nation. So the first is their labor supply issues. A lot of companies and employers complaining about the inability of anybody to find workers to staff certain positions. So that's trend number 1 that I'm sure our other panelists and other economists are also noticing. Trend number 2 is lack of housing, which is another trend that is, shared by everybody else. A lot of multifamily houses going up. Interest rate policy has pushed single family home permits to a decade low, and there's an extremely short supply of single family homes. You know, at the university, I can see anecdotally, we have students and professors that just can't find housing, and this is a problem that you hear everywhere. And then, and, and then in some of the other counties, like, you know, I'm representing the Western Slope, and it's kind of a county specific story, right? So Mace County is the big county, Grand Junction, but you know, each region kind of has its own special thing going on. You got Delta and Montrose. You know, they don't have any specific story, but they've got an extreme housing shortage. You've got some of the counties like Routt County and Garfield that have this strange dynamic with housing. You've got Steamboat and Hayden in Routt, and Glenwood and Rifle. Nobody can afford to live in Steamboat or Glenwood, and you've got people from, you know, the Front Range and California and out of state coming in. They're buying their fourth home, you know, in Steamboat in cash, and or in Glenwood. And then the people who live there, you know, they're getting pushed out further and further. The people who are, I'm sorry, the people who work there get pushed out further and further. And, you know, I get a little bit concerned when I talk to real estate developers in some of these areas. You know, so many of the housing units are purchased by people who don't live there. And so I see that as an issue in those counties. And then I'd say the third issue in the Western Slope is energy. You know, coal is retiring in Northwest Colorado. We've got Moffett, Rio Blanco, and Routt. Excuse me, Rio Blanco and Moffett take the brunt of the hit. You know, there's a decade to kind of create economic development in the region. And so, you know, Moffett County is looking at a pretty large GDP hit, you know, between 40-50% of their GDP comes from coal. You know, Rio Blanco, oil, gas, and coal is about 70% of their GDP. So energy is a big deal for that. Oh, and Garfield, you know, oil and gas is about 30%. Then you get down to Mesa, and you know, it's less than 5%. It's around 4%, and you know, everything in Mesa County that's not oil and gas is doing really well. You know, healthcare is huge. Everything is growing, and you know, Mesa County is a lot less reliant on oil and gas than it used to be, and it still contributes. And then there's Delta and Montrose that, you know, don't have any energy and don't care. Delta used to have coal, but and some people still work in the Gunnison mine, but it's not like a decade ago. So, you know, so energy is still an issue in the Western Slope, but it depends which county you're in the Western Slope. So I'd say, you know, those are my three things that I would bring up.
Great, perfect. And we might dig in deeper to a few of the things you discussed there. But for now, I'll move on. And sorry, Tatiana, I'm going to leave you for last since you're here in person. And I'm going to hand this off to Meredith to talk about Denver and the Northern Front Range.
Thank you, Greg. So at Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation, we are now covering a 10-county area that stretches from Larimer and Weld County all the way down to El Paso County, but I will leave that to Tatiana. So I think obviously very similar to what Dr. Perry said. The thing that we hear about most at Metro Denver and at the Chamber is worker shortage. But I think there are a lot of positive conversations going on with that as well. There are a lot of upskilling programs. There are a lot of new apprenticeship programs and a lot of money going into workforce development in the state. And I think it's hopeful, looking at the governor's budget submission, that there was even more in this year's proposed budget. So we're really focused on, you know, looking at what the gaps are in the labor market and trying to make sure that we're getting the skilled workers in there that we need. And I think when we talk about skilled workers, we're looking at every level. It doesn't have to be college education, although a lot of job postings still want that. But, you know, registered nurses, I think, are number one across Metro Denver in terms of demand. And interestingly, software developers were number two. So I think looking at the data, then a combination of most of the rest of the top 10 job postings were in retail, sales, maintenance, customer service, some of the lower paid jobs, which I think makes sense since we do also have a cost of living issue here that I'll talk about in a second. I think, you know, we're focused so much in the trend in the labor force because since this is a demography center, the birth rate is slowing and the number of retirees are increasing. We have a really strong labor force participation rate, both in the state and in the Metro Denver region. We were number 4 as a state in August, which is really hopeful. But I think there are some headwinds there regarding the cost of living and the cost of services like childcare. Another trend we're seeing is really the interest in kind of the high-tech sectors. In our business development efforts, going out around the country, there's a lot of interest from companies around the country to come here for our concentration of workers in high-tech industries like aerospace and biotech. Clean tech is another one that's growing really quickly. And then I think just the IT tech sector in general. So I think we overperform in those sectors, despite the downturn that we saw earlier this year. The IT tech sector industry cluster that we track, which doesn't track exactly to the information sector, has grown 100% over the last 10 years. And so we're really seeing a large concentration of workers move here for that. We just got a tech hub designation for quantum computing from the federal government, which could lead to a lot more investment in our region for that as well to try to commercialize it. And I think there's a lot of overlap with the other high-tech industries, coming out of NIST and CU Boulder, the Anschutz campus, that will help kind of bring these really high-paying jobs to our region. And then the third trend is inevitably the cost of living and affordability. And I think a lot of that does come down to housing prices and, the fact that we're just not keeping up with the demand. I think it's positive that the home ownership rate for the Denver metropolitan statistical area is higher than it was pre-pandemic. But that is obviously stalled since higher interest rates have come into play and mortgage rates are around 8% now. The average salary needed in Metro Denver to buy a home these days is a lot higher than most households can afford. So that's something that we're tracking closely and are also encouraged that there's so much investment and attention going into that from all levels of government. So I would say those are my top 3 right now.
Great, thank you. And now I will pass this on to Tatiana. Does this move? You might have to come up here.
Hi, I'm the 3D version today. So, can you see me behind? All right, so I mean, it's pretty much the same, right? And these are nationwide trends. I mean, one of the big things everyone's talking about, businesses, government, economists, is that we have, an acute labor shortage. And the good news is we're in the state of Colorado, which is a desirable place to live. And even though population growth is slowing, we still have a lot of people moving here. El Paso County, in particular, I know Elizabeth and I talked during the pandemic. She said, I'm revising everything down. And she's right. But she did go back to El Paso County and say, it's not quite as low as I thought. So if you take out the pandemic years of 2021 in particular, we're back to where we were before in terms of getting roughly 10,000 new residents in El Paso County every year. That's a lot of people moving in. And just like the rest of the state and a lot of the United States, we have a shortage of housing. Legacy of the Great Recession, right? So what do we have now? We have about 0.6 person for each open position. So right there, you can see the labor shortage. But then on top of that is not even accounted for in that number is for every 0.6 person, I mean, it's probably really more like 0.4 if you match skills, right? So you can have a body, but that body doesn't necessarily represent what employers need. And I hear that from a lot of my sponsors, electrical companies and so forth. I even hear that still in the banking industry. It's pretty much across the board, right? Now, El Paso County and Pueblo and a lot of southern Colorado, but particularly those two bigger cities, have the added problem, and this is our other big trend, that this housing affordability is so acute now that we have a shortage, for instance, in Colorado Springs of about 8,500 dwelling units. So that can be multifamily or single family. And that has translated with all of the things that happened during the pandemic to a housing opportunity index. And that measures the proportion of homes that were sold in a given region that were affordable to the median household income. That proportion just before the pandemic was 71%. That's not that too bad. Roughly 3 out of 4 houses were affordable. And that kind of fed that in-migration and so forth, right? The desirability, especially as job opportunities continue to grow. Now that housing opportunity index is down to 25. Unbelievable. And at the height of the pandemic, it was 18. Our current mayor, Mayor Yemi Mobolade, used that statistic a lot to say this is a big problem and this is going to be one of the things that we're going to focus on. I fed him that information, by the way. So that, right there you have, a shortage of workers, a very acute shortage of workers, and now it's really expensive to buy a home there. Our average home price is still increasing, of course, not like the double digits, right, during the pandemic, but we're still increasing 2%, 4%, looking at year over year, it's about 4%. So even with high interest rates, right, and even with this incredible increase in prices, which, by the way, have roughly doubled in the past 7 years, now we're really worried about, are we going to be able to attract the workers that we need, okay? Now, here's the other monkey wrench, my third thing for the Colorado Springs region and also for Pueblo is that you've got this dynamic of, roughly a doubling of the average home price, but then you also have wages that are lower. And not just lower than Colorado, but also lower than the US. Now, when I moved to Colorado 9.5 years ago, everybody kind of said, well, that's not so bad because we're not that expensive. We're not Denver. We're not Boulder. But now we are getting closer to Denver and Boulder in terms of the cost of living, which in Colorado Springs is about 108% of the US average. It was 96% when I moved there. So now we've got this big sort of upside down scenario where it's just expensive to live there and wages are not as high as they need to be. I just would like to get on par in Colorado Springs to the US. So if you look at it, we're 14% lower than the US average wage. How is that ever going to work long term if you're more expensive, right? Now, when I first came to Colorado, one of the things I looked at, and good people like Elizabeth and people at OEDIT and State Demography Office, DOLA, but also CDLE, started to explain to me, let's look at the sectors. And we do have a lot of military in Colorado Springs. And, a retired military person at 32 is a prime working age worker, right? They have pensions. They have benefits, right? So a lot of times it was explained away that we had lower wages because these individuals would, re-enter sort of the private sector, and they'd be willing to take lower wages. And they were sometimes often lower skilled workers. I don't really buy that anymore. We've had such an increase in the number of professional and technical establishments and number of jobs. These are professional jobs that are higher paying. So I just don't buy that, military is going to explain this away. And then, to kind of top it all off, is if we compare our wages to the rest of Colorado, which is driven heavily by Denver, Boulder, we're 19% lower. So this is a big discussion that's happening in Colorado Springs, and of course, those differences are even more acute if you compare it with Pueblo, right? By the way, there were some copies of 2 economic reports that my office produces for El Paso County and for Pueblo. We might be starting it for Greeley as well, that has a lot of these statistics that you can look at. So I'm going to pause there because I know there's some other great questions.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate very much that perspective. And yeah, we're going to go through and kind of dig a little bit deeper on all of what we just heard. And so I'm actually going to start with Meredith. I'm going to change gears a little bit from where we've been. Meredith, if I'm not mistaken, when you are in the office, you're in downtown Denver. So correct me if I'm okay. Yes. So we know that the last few years we've seen a lot of changes in downtowns across the U.S., but Denver has not been immune to that, right? And so I think if I heard recently the current occupancy rate somewhere around 60%, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I just want to kind of talk about that change and what that means for downtown Denver in particular, what you've kind of seen over the last few years as people have kind of switched working habits. There's a lot more people working from home. And what you kind of think what those changes are. Does that impact some of the businesses around the areas? And what's going to be happening kind of as we look towards the future? What do you see as maybe a pathway to changing downtown Denver?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we work on Market Street right by Larimer Square, which is a great location in downtown Denver. And I think the perception right now of downtown Denver is that not all of downtown Denver is as great as the little corner that we're in. So some of the latest commercial real estate figures for office vacancy in downtown is that they're about 30%. Which is extremely high. And the last time I had pulled the data, it was about 25. So it's continuing to inch up, and we're continuing to see more businesses exit the downtown core. Colorado does rank as one of the states with the highest work from home population. Anecdotally, at least, a lot of people have moved here through the pandemic for quality of life and other attributes that we have here. And have worked from home. So that is definitely hurting. I mean, WeWork just announced that they're closing. So we're not even seeing any like significant interest in people going into the office on a regular basis. Downtown Denver Partnership produces high frequency data that we look at. And for September, the traffic in downtown, so whether that's car, pedestrians, just people coming into the downtown core, was about 83% of the pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at the breakdown of that data, a lot of it are visitors to the region. I think Tuesday and Wednesday are the highest in-office days in downtown, per placer data, which isn't perfect, but it's the best that we have. So, we're really seeing a lot of interest in tourists and people coming to downtown more for the restaurants and activities that are offered down there. And, the spikes are obviously like the Denver Nuggets playoffs and Taylor Swift concerts and things like that. So it's definitely being driven by the more arts, culture, entertainment side of what our city has to offer. So I know at the chamber, we talk a lot about, having people come back and work in the office, because that means you're spending money. When you're going out to lunch, you're going to get coffee. I was really surprised that even Starbucks in Larimer Square is closing. So not even Starbucks can manage to last there, which is pretty surprising. So, small businesses, some of the fast casual places have definitely been hurt by not having all of those daytime lunch folks coming in from the office space. So I think that there's a lot of conversations, and Mayor Mike Johnston is really focused on, housing the unhoused population, a lot of whom are in that downtown core area or on the periphery of it, and really reactivating downtown Denver. And I think that means, hosting block parties and, putting on more events in the downtown area to bring more people back and, stimulate economic recovery in the region. Something we talk about a lot also is the lack of childcare in our city and how that impacts workers and labor force participation. And, there are all sorts of conversations about, can we use some of this space for, adaptive reuse for multifamily units or childcare facilities or something to draw people back downtown. And, the adaptive reuse conversation is a long one that we won't get into here, but, that is possible sometimes and very expensive when it is. And I think on the childcare front, what I've heard the most is not the fact that there isn't space for it, because there are a lot of firms that would be willing to give up space to, bring people back into the office and, hire more workers. But it's the lack of workers in the childcare industry that is really, I think, hindering that development almost more so than, the having the physical space for it. So I think those are some of the trends that we've seen downtown. There's a public security component to it where a lot of people say they don't feel safe going downtown. I personally don't feel unsafe. So, it's up to everyone's perspective. And so I know that these are all things that the new mayoral administration is very focused on.
Great. Well, thank you. As someone who used to work downtown and have not in a few years, as I generally work from home now, but used to frequent that Starbucks, I can attest that I'm probably part of that problem, I guess. And so with that, I'm going to move on to Nathan. And so kind of, again, we just talked about transitions here, right? I talked about it a little bit in what I was presenting, just kind of overall where Colorado's been transitioning. Meredith touched on this transition of downtown, and that's sometimes transitions happen fast. Sometimes it's much more slow. And I think I want to focus a little bit, you mentioned on just kind of the diversity of counties on the Western Slope and kind of how the industry mix has really changed over the last few decades and where it's going, right? Energy is a big component of it, but it's also demographics. I'd like you to maybe just talk a little bit more specifically about some of the counties in the region, how they've approached these changes, and where you kind of see things, and what they're kind of suggesting for their future, if they need to reshape it or if they continue what they're doing, and just some of those different perspectives from different places and responses, and any commentary you have on them.
Yeah, thanks. So we can start with Mesa County. If you go back to 2007, 2008, the oil and gas energy boom on the Western Slope was insane. I mean, there was so much money being dumped in wages and capital expenditures that, it caused huge GDP spikes in almost every energy county. If you look at county level GDP in 2007, 2008, it's insane. And, that continued for 3-4 years until about 2009, 2010. And then in a lot of Western Slope counties, you saw what I call the Great Depression in the Western Slope. I mean, you saw several years of negative GDP growth. And, a lot of that energy activity has not come back for a variety of reasons, prices, costs, regulation, some of those things. And so we've got to kind of think about, when we think about transition, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously energy. So what is happening is coal, right? So the coal mines will be shut down within the next 10 to 15 years. And so this is on the mind of every economic developer in Northwest Colorado. And we've seen Delta County already go through this. And, Delta County survived. Those high-paying jobs went away. They didn't have some sort of killer industry that came in and replaced it. You got some remote jobs. They had really good internet infrastructure that created some other opportunities for workers. But ultimately, they just had to go through, their version of the 1930s, and wages and prices kind of had to adjust Great Depression style. And then the economy started moving forward in about 2017. So it was about 7 years. And is what I'm hoping this time around is there's plenty of signaling and time for Moffat County, Rio Blanco County, Western Routt County to plan for this and to bring in enough economic activity so these workers have jobs. And so we got to look at it a couple different ways. If you're looking as a percentage of GDP, I mean, Rio Blanco County energy is 70% of their GDP. Now, if you look at it as a percentage of jobs, it's much smaller. I can't rattle that one off the top of my head. I'd like to tell you I can, but I can't. So it's much smaller. So you got GDP, energy produces a ton of GDP. Then you have wages, it's really big on wages. And then jobs as a percentage is much smaller. And so depending on which metric you look at, you're going to kind of get a different story. And I think you need to look at all three of them. And so, Mesa County, Mesa County is not really going through an energy transition. There's been a scale back, obviously, in oil and gas, but it has become a lot more diversified. And they've done that through healthcare expansion, which has naturally happened just due to the demographics of the region, a lot of migration, and just the isolated nature of Grand Junction. Grand Junction is the healthcare hub. Not on the scale of the Front Range, but we've seen a lot of little tech companies pop up in Grand Junction. So there's more professional services, which has been great. Grand Junction has this fantastic economic development model of bringing in and branding the region as an outdoor rec hub, and not just for tourism, okay? Because we're an hour from Moab. That's, when I go to Moab, I think, okay, this is an interesting economic setup. It's pure tourism. I don't know if this is what I would want in my state. And I think Grand Junction's being really smart about this, saying, oh, hey, come here and visit Grand Junction. But hey, you produce mountain bike parts, we're the place for you. Come manufacture mountain bike parts where everybody loves to mountain bike. And they've branded that, and the city has created a lot of opportunities to recruit businesses in kind of that outdoor recreation space. And the state's been very supportive of the region in that. And it's working for Grand Junction because we're recruiting manufacturing and growing those types of industries. Can Moffat County recruit manufacturing for outdoor rec? Can outdoor rec be a solution everywhere? Well, tourism helps, but there's a lot of competition for tourism. There's a lot of competition for these industry clusters of outdoor rec manufacturing. So I don't know, some of the smaller regions are going to have a difficult time with that. The Northwest Colorado, I think, has some fantastic energy infrastructure. So, and certainly I don't want to take a policy, side, but, you hear small scale nuclear, you hear about hydroelectric, you hear about some of these things that they could plop in there and use the existing energy infrastructure, create GDP, create jobs, create high paying jobs. There's some potential for innovation with colta products, rare earth materials up in that region, kind of readjusting how we look at extracting carbon and using it for different purposes instead of burning it. So, there's a lot of opportunities. And then you've got Routt County, and it's county specific, right? So Routt, they've got so much economic activity in Steamboat these days that I feel like the sphere of influence of Steamboat is going to really help Hayden get over the economic damage that the closing of the coal mines is going to cause. But then Craig is going to be in a different situation, and Rio Blanco is going to be in a different situation. So, and then we take it to the next layer. We talk about transition. Will we be able to fully transition off of oil and gas? I mean, U.S. natural gas consumption is increasing at an increasing rate right now, and again, not taking a political position. I don't get paid enough to do that, but you just look at the data. Maybe we transition off of oil and gas in 10, 20 years, maybe it's 34. I don't know. When I look at the data, I get a little bit pessimistic about a transition. And then you have to ask yourself the question, what's Colorado's role in that? What's the Western Slopes role in that? We have a lot of natural gas out here. So we'll have to see on that. Anyways, I think I've rambled enough and tried to cover your question.
No, that was
So
great. I gave you an open-ended question, so my apologies for.
no.
my
I hope I answered it.
Well, yeah. When you mentioned Moab and Grand Junction, I have to say I do always enjoy a trip out to Moab for mountain biking, but I much more prefer just making my way out to Fruita and Loma and getting a little bit less busy experience. And you can get a Palisade Peach too. So
That's
I
right.
appreciate all that. So thank you, Nathan, and I will pass this along to Tatiana. Tatiana, in particular, you had been talking you've been talking a lot about the overall growth and jobs that have been happening in the region and the strength of the labor market. I was hoping you could maybe get a little bit more specific and talk about what industries in particular have seen a lot of that growth and where you see that going and how that's going to impact the future.
So economists always talk about the notion of comparative advantage, and that hasn't changed. You know, comparative advantage is still something that I kind of latch onto, because why not take whatever, you know, resources, talent, you know, whatever the case may be in a given region and just drive it, right? So you look at a place like Pueblo, you know, manufacturing, right, has always been their area of comparative advantage for a lot of different reasons. And then we all know, primarily in the 70s and 80s, we had a decline in manufacturing in the U.S. with a lot of offshoring. There is a lot, you know, I was a little worried during the pandemic that this talk of reshoring was going to be talk, but it turns out that it's really happening for a host of different reasons, right? And I think it's really positive. And it's not just because, you know, we're dogged about bringing back jobs, which is a good thing. You know, we're dogged about national security, which is a good thing. But it's also a lot of the other countries that we used to rely on to, you know, for this cheap labor. It's just not that cheap anymore. China is a great example in terms of, you know, a lot of the population now going to the middle class. So why not bring back some of these jobs? And for instance, you know, in Pueblo, there's, because I do work with them, they're very excited about the possibility of this Project Danish is the, you know, sort of code term for it, for a huge wind turbine company coming in. And they already do some of that, and they're already, you know, bringing back some of their manufacturing. This would be 2,300 jobs. Between local and state incentives, it'd be $40 million. So, and we're competing against two other states. I think it's Texas and North Dakota. So if you look at something like that, that would be transformational. The number of new jobs needed to match population growth in Pueblo, and Elizabeth helped me with this, is about 450, 500 jobs. And they've been actually doing fairly well, between, you know, 500 and 1,000 new jobs per year. So 2,300 new jobs once this, you know, wind turbine facility would be, you know, up and running, is a big deal, right? The other thing that Pueblo has is they have a lot of, you know, middle skill workers that have been displaced, you know, sometimes leaving the region. But now, having gotten to know Pueblo, people want to stay there. So you're seeing something that I think is happening in many middle-tier cities and smaller cities, and that is that the community colleges, if there's a state college there, even employers are saying, let's do the training programs for these. And as was mentioned earlier, these are not typically four-year degrees. And, you know, enrollments for four-year degrees in the United States are coming down anyway, and that's a whole other topic, right? So manufacturing, there are of course other things. Pueblo is also looking at rebuilding their North Shore Marina and making it into something that is much greater than it is right now, with a hotel and other amenities and so forth. So they're also looking at building upon their tourism industry, right? And then if you go further south, you know, those are some of the counties that are not growing as much and that are sometimes losing population. But one thing that I'm heartened by, you know, these, if any of you know of these Opportunity Now grants and other grants that the state has been pursuing, you know, our past governor and our current governor are really focused on not just the Front Range. Let's pull up these other regions in terms of housing affordability, in terms of new industries or growing existing industries. So for instance, one of the grants that I'm part of, hopefully that'll get funded, is in Trinidad. And Las Animas County and a couple of other counties in that portion of the state saying, you know, let's capitalize on the fact that so many companies are now remote, and let's zero in on what's worked in some other more prosperous areas like Fremont County, and let's take this this thing called Emergent Campus, where you have like many companies that are big along the Front Range have presence in these southern counties, and attract some of these individuals. By the way, some of them already moved there during the pandemic. Some of these high-tech workers who are saying, yeah, you know, we'll definitely stay here, and if you bring us a little office close by, yeah, sure, we'll take some interns. So hopefully grow that ecosystem. And then, you know, some of the other great things that Nathan and Meredith talked about. In Colorado Springs, again, comparative advantage. We've got 5 military installations, and it's not just Department of Defense. We have a lot of government contracting in general. And now with the decision for Space Command, I'd say the sky, the space, universe is the limit, because we have so many companies that are already there that now are just going to continue to grow, and that ecosystem is just going to continue to expand. Healthcare and social assistance, almost every region that I know of in the United States should capitalize on that. A lot of economists say that that's not a primary industry. You're not bringing new jobs in like you are, for instance, for Space Command and federal dollars. I don't always buy that, because, for instance, something that I work with UC Health in Colorado Springs is, let's take some of the parts of Colorado Springs, like Southeast, that do not have a high graduation rate, do not have a high post-secondary educational attainment rate, and let's start training those kids for some of these healthcare jobs. And UC Health is paying for it. And let's capitalize on the fact that some of these employers are so desperate for workers that they're willing to either fully pay for the training or partially pay for the training, or even bring in 18-year-olds at decent wages and upskill them. So I see some of those sectors also really taking off. Transportation and warehousing, that's a huge thing, both in Pueblo and Colorado Springs. Yes, okay, the pandemic is over, but these facilities that have been built close to airports and so forth, those are also, not high-paying jobs, but they're at least middle-skilled jobs that are, livable wages. And then there are a few others. Certainly the construction industry, as our population, even though it's slower as it continues to grow, we have another great program also in Colorado Springs from the Home Builders Association, Careers in Construction. So we have something called the Mill in the southern part of the city, where kids go and they learn the trades inside this huge warehouse. And again, it was primarily builders who built out this facility. So again, building on these areas of comparative advantage, I think, is really where we're going to be heading in the future. And also the reports that were put on the table, I have graphs just like Greg had in terms of what are the top growing industries by employment and by GMP.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate always hearing those perspectives. When you talk about some of that vocational training, I have to say, when I was in high school, I went to a vocational high school for it, and it was, while I'm not actually in the theater arts, as I spent my time doing, it was great real-world training. Anyway, we are kind of at time, and so I want to just wrap up by taking one of the questions out of that we've gotten on this, and I'm actually going to just redirect this to Tatiana and pick on her because she's here. But we had a question on the topic of jobs, data on multiple job holders. So it says, what data is there on people working multiple jobs, and how does that reflect in the migration trends and cost of living in Colorado? So Tatiana, I'm going to invite you back up and get some of your thoughts on multiple job holding rates.
That's a really interesting topic because it's not something that I think was as ubiquitous in the past as it is now. And coincidentally, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, I do a economic update on a local channel in Colorado, and it's on Fox 21, and I did that on these multiple job holders. And no great surprise, and let me back up here. Part of the reason I started to look into this is you have all heard how a recession is coming, right? And it's been coming for about 18 months now. And we're still waiting, and now the probability of a soft landing with maybe no recession or just a very mild contraction or mild slowdown, maybe a 0.5% growth rate, but not negative. Whatever it is, it's going to slow down a little bit. But the thing that's, part of the reason we've been waiting for 18 months for this, recession to hit is because, when interest rates are this high and, the consumer's getting squeezed with inflation, usually expenditures come down, right? Household expenditures. Hasn't really happened. And so we had this excess savings from the pandemic. Well, savings rates were 7.5% roughly. before the pandemic, and now they're 3.5%. Credit card usage is going up. Delinquency rates for credit cards and auto are coming up a little bit, but people are still spending. So you're like, well, what's going on here? Is it all borrowing? Well, some of it's borrowing, but guess what? A lot of it is also people holding second jobs, which is amazing. And if you look at the data, it's primarily millennials and even Gen Z, some of the early workers. And guess what? They know how to use technology really well. I was amazed at some good research that was done with millennials using AI to like have this little side gig. They're also great web developers and coders and so forth, sometimes self-taught. So about 25% of the millennials that were surveyed say they hold a second job, and supposedly that's even kind of conservative. Now, you talk to some, older people who I sometimes work with, and they're like, it's those daggone millennials who don't go into work, and they're holding 2 jobs, and they're making extra money on the side, and but they're not really doing their main job very well. Whatever the case may be, they're making it work. And if you talk to them, and some of the Gen Z as well, they turn around and they say, well, that's how I'm going to try to buy a house, because now I need $100,000 saved. Plus, I've got these student loans that are, started up again in October and so forth. So the multiple job holder rate is, I think, looking at the data, much, much higher than it's been in the past. And you can kind of understand why, with the cost of living also being what it is, right, with inflation. Now, if you look at older cohorts, it does come down, but again, we don't know how much of that is actually captured in the data. I mean, I personally know some 40, 50-year-olds who have a job and they do a little bit of Uber on the side. So now the opportunities there, not just in the tech, but also in some of the service-related industries, like ride sharing and so forth, are also there. And those weren't there as much in the past either.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. It was really great perspective on that older front. I have to say my mom has always been indicative of this. We're from Vermont, but I think it's a rural phenomenon often, which is she was a school librarian and then also worked at an elder care facility and also was working at a retail job for an outdoor retailer. So you definitely see this, I think, in rural places there, but I see this a lot in rural Colorado too. And increasingly everywhere, it sounds like. So with that, I'm going to have to wrap up this panel. I think we have 15 minutes, if someone confirm, for a break, and then we will get back started around 10:40.